Hey everybody, how the heck you doing this fine day? Steve Dotto here, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. We are some kind of thrilled that you are joining us here for our Webinar Wednesday on a beginner's guide to podcasting. I see you folks are getting in the room, and I'm starting to see chat happening, so I am very, very, very pleased about that. So let us, for some reason, I'm not getting us here yet, so give me a half a second here to get things organized. There we go. Hopefully we'll start streaming here in a moment. Oh, good. We've got people on both YouTube and on Facebook. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Well, I don't see it. It's not coming through on my computer here, but I'll have to just have faith that we are going through. Let's bring April in and get things started. How you doing, April?
I'm good. Hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday indeed. So have you, Beginner's Guide to Podcasting. Have you ever, do you listen to podcasts?
I don't listen to podcasts very often, to be honest with you. I do listen to, I listen to yours. So that counts.
You're too busy.
Yeah, you know what? I actually, when I do listen to podcasts, it's usually in the car. And so lately I haven't been in the car a lot because I liked that, that being able to kind of focus on, that's a good time for me to be listening to podcasts. So clearly I'm not driving much these days.
When I decided to do this week's episode on podcasting, there's a couple factors. I mean, obviously we've been re-energized on our own podcast, but here in Canada, just recently, a huge network of sports stations, of sports talk radio stations, just closed. They just literally let everybody go in talk radio, like a sports one, which we'd think is good. And it's a national company. They weren't in financial trouble or anything. They just decided to let everybody go, and they changed their format completely. And they went to something that they don't even have to have anybody working on. They're doing like recorded comedy. But it made me think about the future of radio and what's happening with podcasting. And and I got a new one of these Apple CarPlays installed in my car.
Sure.
And since that's been in, it's harder to listen to radio in a modern car than it is to listen to a podcast. Finding the tuner and getting through to the tuner, it's more work to listen to a radio than it is to just hit the podcast button, which is right there with all of your podcasts in it.
Right.
So think about that for a minute. Think about access. Think about at home, if you want to listen to radio, if you have a radio in your house. A lot of people still have them. I don't actually have an old radio in my house anymore. I've got a smart speaker. Again, it's just as easy. It's just as easy to ask it to play a radio station as it is a podcast, but you can do that as well. So it's just kind of, it's one of the things that brought it home to roost for me of what's happening.
It's true. Yeah, for some reason, our video is not streaming on YouTube.
Okay. So let me just.
It is on Facebook.
It says that it's here. We had some comments from people on YouTube, but I wonder where they're watching.
Yeah, I don't know if they can hear it. Like I can't. I'm hearing nothing, but the Facebook feed is working.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Strange.
What the world could be happening?
YouTube was a little wonky for me earlier today too. Like I was playing a video or something and it was not working right. So maybe YouTube's having problem. Oh, somebody says they see and hear on YouTube. So let's see.
You're on the Dotto Tech channel on YouTube, correct?
I am.
They are. No, I'm on the Dotto Tech channel here, and I'm not getting anything.
Yeah, I'm not getting anything either on the Dotto Tech channel, but I am getting it on Facebook.
This is very frustrating.
I know. I'm sorry.
Well, it's not your fault.
I know, but I still can apologize.
This is the second week in a row we've had technical issues, and I thought I'd solved them all. But I hadn't anticipated this one. But I'm checking my setup, and it is indeed scheduled to be streaming on YouTube, as is correct.
Yeah, I wonder. Let me see if there's YouTube
And
issues.
some people are getting it, but I was very slowly seeing more people on. Like it says that there's 50 people watching on YouTube now, which is a fraction of who should be watching.
Oh no, I see 253 people watching on YouTube.
Do you?
Mm-hmm.
I see 50 here.
I see.
Now it's
I see
starting to.
253.
It's going down on my side. I think people are saying, that's enough, Steve. We've got better things to do than to wait for you to get your act together. This is...
So David is saying that it's currently streaming on YouTube. I wonder if it's on your... Strange. And some people are saying it's waiting for you.
Yeah, that's what it says right here. It's waiting.
And some people... Very weird.
Yep, it is definitely not. It's not feeding here for me.
Well, we're up to 113 over on our Facebook. And friends, don't forget to like our page at .otech there.
You know what you could do, April, is drop the Facebook feed into the YouTube chat.
I did a few
times. So that
times,
if people
actually
want to do it, they can pop over and we will get going and we will hope that it will come on YouTube. And we will struggle on through. One more vote for dedicated webinar packages as we go along. Well, rather than spend too much, so hopefully people, if you're heading over if you're on Facebook, of course, you're getting us right now. If you're not getting us on YouTube, there's not much point in me saying much to you, is there? So,
there's some people that are getting it on YouTube, so it's bizarre.
And they should just stay. It'll be fine for them.
Yeah.
It'll be fine for them. Yeah, all the Facebook. So thanks for your patience, folks. And let me get into the routine, and we will see what happens here ultimately. And when I get into streaming the video, we will play a little bit more with our settings and see if we can't kickstart the YouTube feed. You said YouTube was giving you trouble earlier today. That's good to know.
Yep.
All right. So before we begin, I got to do a big shout out to our patrons. Otech, this channel, when we are publishing, is supported through the generosity of our patrons. Every week we host a free webinar, such as this one, Webinar Wednesday, where we teach different aspects of content marketing, content creation, and online marketing. And we teach you in productivity, as well as productivity. And we do these lessons absolutely free. And we leave the lessons up online for free for a week after we initially broadcast them. And then we archive them, and they are stored in our archives. So this is 163, Webinar Wednesday 163. And they're stored in our archive, and they're there for our patrons who have access to all of the back catalog, which is just awesome for them. So if you are interested in supporting Otech, if you find what we do here of value, we encourage you to stop by our page at Otech at patreon.com/Otech, and there jump in and support. And as for those of you on the stream now who are supporting us on Patreon, our thanks to you one and all. We appreciate your support. So let's jump into the topic then. We're going to be talking about podcasting. Now, I kind of went overboard this week, folks. I recorded the video as per normal. I pre-record our video, and normally it's 20 to 25 minutes. Sometimes we go to 30 minutes of content, but I've got so much to say about podcasting. I'm so excited about what's happening in the world of podcasting this year that I ended up recording a full 40 minutes. Actually, it was longer, and I edited it down. So let us get that streaming. And while it's streaming, we will hopefully it'll kickstart things onto YouTube. And we will see, while we're going on, we will answer as many questions as we can in chat. And we'll take your questions once we are done. So April, we will retire to the green room, and let's get the video up and playing. So glad that you are joining us to talk today about podcasting, which I am increasingly excited about because of, well, I will show you why I'm excited. So coming up in this video, I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. I've got a lot of ground to cover, so buckle up and pay attention. Don't worry about taking notes. We have the shared note, which we will share with you after the podcast is over. So we're going to talk today about what makes podcasting so great, just why it is I am so bloody bullish on podcasting. We're going to talk about the game changers, the things that I'm really excited about coming up this year in podcasting. We're going to take a look at podcast workflow, how a podcast is built, to give you an idea. Those of you who haven't done a podcast or have only listened, but to understand how they come together and the different pieces of the puzzle, because there's a lot of There's a lot of small steps in creating a podcast, a lot of simple apps and relationships, cloud services that you have to have in place to make it all work. Not overly complicated, but they all have to be there. We're going to talk about how you can start a podcast, and we will talk about the tools and the technology that you need in order to do that. And of course, tons of resources that we will be sharing with you through the shared note. So let us begin. Okay, well, let's start now with why I'm so bullish on podcasting, why I think it's so exciting. And I know you've heard it before. You've probably heard me say 5 or 6 times over the last 15 years, or you might have heard me say, that this is the year of podcasting, that it's going to explode this year. And I'm saying it again. But I think that our idea of scale and the numbers and explosion, I think that needs to be adjusted. And I'll work my way through the numbers with you today to show you that. But while the sheer numbers of podcasts isn't ever going to reach YouTube's numbers or the number of blogs that there are, the value to the people who create podcasts and the value of podcasts to the listeners, that is what is increasing dramatically. It's not that the overall mass numbers are growing dramatically. It's that the business case for podcasts has never been better, and that is growing as we speak. Allow me to explore the numbers with you right now. We're going to start by the fact that there is limited competition in podcasts. Today, there are approximately 1.75, roughly, million podcasts, which sounds like a lot. I will admit that sounds like a lot. And it's exploded over the past year. As far as growth, we've had pretty dramatic growth in the overall numbers in the last year. At the start of the pandemic, there were about 800,000 podcasts. So we can understand people had more time at home. They were looking for new ways of reaching their marketplace. So it's completely understandable why the overall number of podcasts has roughly doubled. And it sounds like a lot. 1.75 million sounds a lot. But let's compare it to other social platforms. 37 million YouTube channels. It's a lot harder to get discovered on YouTube than in a podcast based on those numbers alone. There's 507 million blogs out there of people writing blogs and over 1 billion websites. So all of the other platforms and the social platforms and the online platforms have way greater number, which means it's way more difficult to be discovered. And when people think about starting a podcast and they're saying, oh, there's too many podcasts out there, there's too many in my space, we have to look at these numbers. And you need to recognize that nobody says, oh, there's no room for another YouTube channel or there's no room for another website, even though those markets are far more saturated than the podcast market. So that's point one. Another key thing to think about in this is even though there's 1.8 roughly million podcasts, only about 600,000 of those are active. And by active, we mean that they've downloaded a podcast or they've uploaded a podcast in the last 30 days. So many of them are dormant, or they are kind of 1 or 2 offs. They did a season, they did a dozen shows and they stopped, or they did 5 shows and they stopped, or they did 60 shows and they stopped. But when you go into your podcast app and you see that a podcast, that the last time that the podcaster uploaded was 2017 or 2018, and you see this a lot, you don't really bother tuning into those podcasts because you realize that they're not relevant, unless it's an entertainment podcast or like a murder mystery or a real crime. And those sorts of podcasts have long-term legs, but not business-related podcasts and the sort of content that we create, at least that I create. There's no long-term value. There's limited term value, a year, maybe 18 months, but certainly not several years worth of value. There's a great summary of all of these different podcast statistics, which I will share with you in the shared note. So based on those numbers, I think you'll agree that there's still tremendous opportunity in the world of podcasting. Now let's take a look at the nature of the podcast itself. When we start looking at different statistics on podcast, one number for me is a show-stopping number, and that is the retention rate for podcasts. Podcasts, if somebody downloads a podcast and listens to your podcast, they listen on average to 80% of that podcast or greater. It's greater than 80%. Many podcasts are in the 90% range, which is a staggering statistic. If I upload a YouTube video and I get 40% retention of where people watch 40% of the video, I'm a rock star on YouTube. And typically speaking, YouTube videos are far shorter than podcasts. So think about it. If a podcast is an hour long, which many of them are, and people are consuming 80% of that podcast, they're listening to, what is that, like 45, 50 minutes of the podcast they're listening to, which is a tremendous amount of ear time that we have, or attention that's being paid by the podcast listener to the podcast creator. That is just a spectacular number, which should be really encouraging. And when you start to marry that statistic to the other metrics that are in the podcast space, you start to realize why I'm so bullish on it as far as our community, as far as content marketers go. Next up, we own the land. Unlike every other social platform, the relationship between podcaster and consumer is a direct connection. We create the podcast, upload it into our podcast host, and an RSS feed delivers that podcast to the person who has subscribed. So we aren't based on an algorithm or a feed. When people are searching for podcasts, then the algorithms come into play. But once somebody has subscribed to you, once you have convinced somebody that your podcast is of value, the subscription between you and them is your deal. It's not going to be served in a news feed and having somebody like Facebook or YouTube decide which videos or which podcasts are going to be delivered into the inbox of your community. Once they subscribe, it's just like an email. They get that subscription sent to them and nobody stands in the way. Very valuable. I could actually speak for hours just on those topics, but I think we have to move through the content fairly quickly. But I think you get my point about some of the underlying values of podcasts. Now let's talk about things that I think are game changers. Technology trends that are changing that are all in massive favor of podcasts. And the first is the evolution of smart speakers. The fact that we now have so many Google Homes and Apple HomePods and Amazon Alexas in the home. The vast majority of podcasts, believe it or not, are consumed in the home, not in the car. I would have thought that the number was in the car, but I think it's something like 27% get consumed in the car. The majority are consumed at home. Well, they're even more accessible now with the smart speakers because people have a good sound system and easy access. You just have to tell the smart speaker to play a podcast and they will play that podcast. So accessibility has never been better. As far as the business case for the podcaster, the evolution of dynamic ads. One of the challenges of creating a podcast when you start doing the business side and getting sponsorship involved, although I think a very small percentage of podcasts require paid sponsorship to be successful. I think that they can be very successful without any advertising at all. But the ones that do rely on advertising, all of the ads are typically baked right into the podcast. They're host-read ads where the host reads an ad out and it's basically locked. And even if you did that podcast 6 years ago, you're going to hear a 6-year-old ad if you listen to the older podcast. With dynamic ads can be inserted at different points within the podcast, and the podcast can then you can serve different ads depending on where you are in your business cycle or where you are in the advertising cycle or where your sponsors are at different times within your podcast. So it gives the podcast host a lot more flexibility as far as that's concerned. It's not something that most of us will dive into, but it does provide a kind of a more mature platform that podcasts that require ad revenue can grow from. There's more major players than ever. Now we start to see real competition now springing up between Apple and Spotify and Google, all in the space of hosting podcasts, and they're actually starting to bid against each other for the best podcasts. And we're seeing major labels and studios stepping up and realizing that podcasts can have real value, and they're starting to put production values into those podcasts, recognizing that it's kind of virgin territory. It's the Wild West that they can still grab a piece of. So we're seeing lots of energy coming from significant players in it, which is going to help us all. The last two are the two most exciting for me, is the growth of the ability to transcribe audio into text, and the fact that podcasts can now be easily transcribed through machine language. It can just scrape through your podcast and create a transcript from listening to your podcast, and that can be searched. Google has the ability to listen to the audio, and then search based on the audio that it's listening to. And now Google has announced that it's going to start to insert podcast in their search results. So when you go and search for something, if it's mentioned in a podcast, and if that podcast starts to rank for it within Google search, it is now going to surface in Google search. And that is a game changer for us all. The biggest value that we have in YouTube is the fact it's a search engine. People find what they're looking for in YouTube as being recommended through search. That same value is slowly now going to start to be inserted into the podcast space. Not just our blog posts that we post with our podcast embedded in it, but actual searches of the podcast content itself from Google. The value there is going to be immense.
Podcasts. There are a million of them, and they're all amazing. John Ralphio and I have one called Not Your Average Podcast, where we rate different kinds of nachos. But
Okay, that's enough. No more talking.
But you told me to get it all out of my system.
I had no idea how much you had in your system.
Okay, smarty pants, I can hear you saying already. Okay, if it's so great, why isn't there a gold rush to podcasts? Why isn't everybody and their Uncle Fred creating podcasts right now? And I think there's a couple of reasons. The first is, I don't think podcasts set up well for the vanity metrics, for nurturing the podcast creator in the same way as other platforms do. You know, when we start publishing in social, we become very needy creatures. Publishing a YouTube video, people are immediately looking how many views they have and how many comments, and they're looking for positive comments coming back. And they typically get that. They typically get views. And if it's a good video, it gets shared a little bit more. And there's the really good social platform of YouTube to create instant viral growth. And so you feel like you have a lot of success very early on when you start, say, publishing a YouTube video. Even putting out an Instagram or a Facebook post. We put out a post and then we see how many people like it and how many people have viewed it and how many people comment to us. And it nurtures us, and it makes us feel good because people are engaging with our content, which encourages us to create more content. Podcasters have to have a more sense of self than people publishing on other social platforms, because you create a podcast, you upload it, people download it, and that's it. You don't really typically hear from. You can put calls to action in, and we encourage you to do that, to put in a call to action to download a worksheet, or you might be running ads or something in it that causes some interaction to happen. But the numbers are going to be very low. They aren't going to be enough to move the needle for you as far as the ego goes. You're not going to be getting a whole bunch of people commenting, and you're not going to get a whole bunch of viral growth from those comments, typically in a podcast that we produce in our space, in content marketing in the business space. There's going to be very slow growth. Now, that does not mean that people are not listening to that podcast, consuming that podcast, and finding value. If you start out with a podcast and you have 20 downloads, you might be disappointed. You might go, darn it, only 20 downloads. But if you are only doing the average listen time of those downloads, and every week you get 20, so you have at least 20 people that are downloading every week to start, that's 20 people who are listening to 80% of the content you delivered. And if your content is, as we say, if it's 80 minutes, if it's an hour long, it's like roughly 45 minutes, you have suddenly 45 minutes of access to 20 people that are laser focused and interested in your content. So the value is there. It's just we don't get the same level of feedback and encouragement. That is, I think, the biggest issues that podcasters have. So consequently, they don't feel that they're making much progress, and the download numbers will grow slowly. So they lose energy, they lose momentum, they lose their spirit, and they stop creating the podcast. Because it's also really easy to stop creating a podcast because people aren't going to start commenting to you. It's not like you stop producing a video or you stop posting where people say, hey, Steve, where are you? Why aren't you there? Because you have ready access on the social platforms. But a podcaster, that goes away, just kind of drifts away and nobody says too much about it. So we're not very comfortable working in that vacuum. If you can get yourself to where you are comfortable working in that vacuum, you can become one of that small number of podcasts that is incredibly successful and incredibly valuable. The other thing, which I just skirted around, is when you create a podcast, unlike posting an Instagram post or even a YouTube video, The people who choose to download your podcast are interested, invested in the content that you are sharing, because there are multiple options. It does require a lot of intention to actually subscribe or download the podcast and then hit play on the podcast. So there's a lot of buy-in from people listening to the podcast. So you know that there are very few accidental listens. Almost everybody consuming a podcast is vested in the content of that podcast, which again is fantastic for us as far as creating a real engagement, but we don't get that feedback coming very quickly. And that's the area that I think most podcasters kind of run into trouble. Okay, I'm going to take 5 or 6 minutes right now, and I'm going to walk you through the production process of a podcast. Now, this is our process for producing our podcast, but most podcasters are going to do something similar to what we do here. But along the way, I'm going to tell you the importance of each step. So, of course, it starts with recording the podcast. We'll be talking about some different tools you have to record podcasts in just a few moments. But this is the tool that I record and edit my podcast in. I use a tool called Hindenburg Journalist Pro, which is fairly expensive as far as audio editing apps. Let me take you on a super quick demo of Hindenburg. So this is actually a file, which is a file in progress. This is a podcast that I'm working on right now, which is going to be uploaded. It's our next podcast to be uploaded. So I've already recorded all of the different assets. Now, you don't see them here in the timeline yet, but they are all over here in these different bins. So these are all of the different blocks that we've recorded. So all Rachel and I doing the A block, opening the show, doing the wrap. We have beneath it all of the different assets that we have, such as our different ads that we insert into each show. And then down below are our different music beds that I like to put underneath it. So later on today, or when I'm ready to edit this podcast, I will pull these different elements out and I will start to edit them and clean them up. So for example, if I was working on the very end of the show, I would bring out the wrap that we have here, which Rachel and I have already recorded, and I'd come here to the end of it, and I can edit this timeline here using Hindenburg Composer. Journalist Pro, excuse me, Hindenburg Journalist Pro. So if I put my cursor at any point, we can listen to what's being said.
Oh, it is.
This is like the Pi Day. We got Pi Day coming up. So 58 gray is Steve's birth year. There we go. Till next week. Have fun storming the castle. So maybe I want to take out that little laugh that I had there, and I just want to have from till next week. Till next week. And so you can see right there, that's where I say the word till, right there. Next week. Oops, right there. Till next week. So what I might do here is I could actually highlight both of these columns here. I could take it out, delete it. So this is how you go through and you clean up ums and ahs, or you clean up sections of the podcast that you don't want to have within it. So you see that it's been deleted there. And now I can play again. There we go. Till next week. Have fun storming the castle.
You think it'll work? It would take a miracle.
So I might say, okay, we are going to end on my line, not Rachel in my line. So I'm going to now delete this last little bit here. There we go. It's cleaned up now. So now I'm going to grab some of our music, and let's put this music here underneath. And this is kind of some of the typical music. Now I see that I can see here, I can actually ramp the music up to cause it to come up more slowly at the very end if I wanted. So now we can have a listen. Storming the castle. So you can see going through this process here, we can assemble the entire podcast. The reason I love Hindenburg Composer so much is the way that we organize all of the different assets here in the bins, and also a lot of tools that are built into it as far as editing goes. For example, when we pull interviews in, if we do interviews in different locations, we have the audio files. When we pull them in, it does a brilliant job of leveling them all so that all of the audio sounds at the same level as you're editing. With a typical audio editing package, you have to go through a lot of effort to make sure that the interview and the interviewee, if you're doing a double ender, is at the same audio level. Hindenburg does a great job of doing those things that are ever so important to us actually getting things done. So once this podcast is complete, I will then export it, go into the export feature, and I will export the entire podcast, and I will actually save it up into Dropbox. Then we will have a MP3 file in Dropbox, which will be our composed podcast. The next stage, as far as the podcast workflow, is to go into our podcast app. Now, this is our podcast hosting app. So I use a tool called Podbean. Similar ones are Libsyn or Sprout Social. These are all different services that will host your podcast. And so if we go to my dashboard here, we can see it'll show us, kind of give us analytics of how our last few podcasts are performing. And we see overall we're up 4% over the previous 14 days. Yay, we're very happy there. So I can go here into the back end and I can take a look at my episode list. And this is actually last week's podcast. We haven't started to build this week's yet, but I can go in and I can view it in a couple of different ways. But let me first of all take you into the editor and show you the different pieces. So when you create a new podcast and upload it to your podcast host, you can, in our particular case, our podcast host has the ability for us to create a web page around it. So in a lot of cases, you might not need to create your own website if you're hosting through any of the major podcast hosting sites, because they all have this ability for you to be able to create your own post with your podcast in it. Now, we uploaded the podcast. You would have seen a little flash screen as we went in here saying to upload a file. So you just click on an upload file. It uploads it and it tells you when it's ready. And it's telling us what the file name is here, right at the very top. You add your artwork, the square artwork, which is what's going to appear in most mobile players like Apple's iTunes. You put your copy in with any links that you want to add, and then you set the time for it to be published. Right now, I could update this if I wanted to change the copy, but it would say publish, or it would be schedule the publish down here in this button here that we would do once we've composed all of the different elements that are going to go into this post. Now, this is a very simple way of doing them. Let me just go back to the episode list, and I'll show you what this podcast would look like hosted in Podbean, hosted. So I can basically share this URL if I choose, instead of creating our own post, which is what we actually do. We actually go into our own website and we upload it as well to our own website. But this is what it looks like. So if you are just starting out and you haven't yet set up your own podcast host and your own website, and you haven't figured out how you want to post your podcasts on your website, you're perfectly fine just using the podcast hosts until you're ready to do your own. Now, one of the other things that will happen here is, here we've got the ability, if we go on this link here, this is where we can go and we can grab something called an embed code. So we grab this code here, and this is what we use to create and to put the podcast on our own page. So this is the exact same content as you saw on the podcast hosts page, living on dototech.com. And there is the embed code that we dropped in, which has the player so people can listen to this podcast. So as you can see, the actual publishing of a podcast is kind of copy and paste once you've set it up for the first time. I want to take a step back before we talk about the tools and how you actually go about creating those audio files and creating that podcast. I want to take a step back and talk to you about a few of the terms that I just used as I was walking through the publishing process for a podcast. Now, I talked about 3 different players, 3 different services that we use in delivering a podcast: the podcast host, the platform, and listening apps. And I think a lot of us get confused about each one does, and there's good reason for that. The good reason is many of these different services do multiple things. So figure it's not like we have clearly defined lines between each one. But broadly speaking, let's go through them so you can understand who the companies are that you'll be working with to facilitate publishing a podcast. The first is the host. The host is where you upload your podcast. That was the one that you just saw, was my host, which is Podbean, but the other ones are Libsyn, Anchor, Simplecast, and there's many other podcast hosts. Now, a lot of them will allow you to sign up for free and do your first podcast for free, and maybe a small number, a limited number of podcasts per month for free, with limited analytics, etc., in the back end, with limited extra functionality. But you can often start for free, which is terrific. Now, they take your file that you upload, and they then take it, and once you publish that file, they distribute it to the different podcast platforms. Now, in some cases, they also act as a platform, but they also will distribute it to all of their competitors in that case, in the RSS feed, so that when somebody goes, if you upload through Podbean and somebody goes on Apple and they're looking for baby boomer business podcasts, they will discover my podcast because it's now been distributed to Apple through Podbean. I hope that makes sense. The platforms themselves, there's again a number of them, but the main players are, of course, Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, Stitcher. These are the main players in that space where people think of them globally. Now, in some cases, for example, Spotify, it also has a relationship with Anchor. It actually owns Anchor now, so we're starting to see some melding happening in those places as well. Then there are listening apps, and these are tools that are designed to make the podcast experience better. None of our major platforms, frankly, have done a terrific, well, Spotify has actually done a pretty good job, but none of the others have done a terrific job of making it easy for you to discover and manage your podcasts. So everybody thinks that they have a better way of doing things. And so we have all of these other tools that you can use to listen to your podcast, because you can listen to them because it's just an RSS feed, kind of like a web browser. You can view them through multiple different tools. So the one that I like and that use is called Overcast. But there's also TuneIn Radio. The Apple Podcast Player is a listening app, as is the Google Podcast Player, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean. Multiple companies have their own podcast players. So recognizing that some people will subscribe to you through their podcast player and not through the platform. So as you can see, there's a lot of crossover that happens. But essentially, in the simplest form, you create your podcast as an audio file. You add the extra information, such as the podcast description and the content that's going to be uploaded with your podcast. You upload it through your podcast provider. They then distribute it to the platform and the listening apps, and that's the way that it happens. As far as your listeners are concerned, they use the app of choice that they like to use. If they like to use Apple Podcasts, they find you through Apple Podcasts. If they like to use Stitcher, they can find you through Stitcher, and they can subscribe to it through those platforms. Now, I know everybody's chomping at the bit to get into the technology and the tools that we use. Now, I did show you one tool, which is Hindenburg, which is the top end, kind of one of the high-end audio editing apps, which I use for creating my podcast. But let's kind of go through 4 stages: super simple, simple, intermediate, and advanced, as far as typical podcast setup and things that you'd consider and kind of what investment would be. So in the simplest level, your podcast recording app and tool can be your smartphone. There's no reason it can't be. And as far as getting really, really super simple, you can use Anchor, which is a free service that'll allow you to record your podcast on your smartphone, upload it, and it does all of the things that you saw Podbean do for me. Anchor will do for you as well. And Anchor is one of the reasons we have had such a growth in podcasts over the last year. Many people have started a podcast on Anchor because it is so easy to create a podcast on Anchor. You know, if you want to kind of compare it to things, think about website builders and think about the ones that are really automatic and simple and free, like Wix. Anchor is the Wix of podcasting applications. You can start out, you can get to know what you're doing, you can use it for a long time if you want to, but most serious podcasters would rather have a relationship with a podcast host themselves and have a little bit more control over the entire process. But Anchor is a great place to start, and they've got you can record right on your smartphone, just using your earbuds or even the microphone on the smartphone, or buy a slightly better mic and plug it into the smartphone. You can record a podcast right there using your smartphone. Talk about simple, free to start. You've already got all of the tools. If you've got a good idea, that might be the way you get started. Then we can kind of step up to the next level. And for a simple podcast, if you're going to be purchasing any piece of equipment, I could spend hours talking to you about microphones, but the ATR 2100 is probably the best bang for your buck as far as a USB mic. You just plug it in. Rachel, who is my producer on my podcast, she records with it. It sounds absolutely fantastic. So it is $130 or Canadian. It's even less than the States, of course. So that, if you want to step up and get yourself a good quality mic that you could use for a long time, that's a great investment. And then as far as editing your podcast, at that point there, you're going to use an audio editing app. If you're on a Mac, GarageBand is a great place to start. And if you're in Windows, you can download Audacity. It's going to take you a little bit longer to learn how to use, but it will give you, as far as cost, it's free. So this is a very low barrier for entry for signing up and starting your own podcast. Now, as far as podcast hosts, you could still use Anchor if you chose, but instead I would suggest that you start looking at some of the other podcasting apps. For example, Podbean, which I have. By the way, the link that I have in the description is an affiliate link. It's the first time I've actually shared it, I think. So, but it is an affiliate link, just so you know. You can see here that they will host, they have a free basic service, which gives you 5 hours of total storage space. So you can have, if you have a half-hour podcast, you can store 10 podcasts for free, and some very basic features. Not a lot as far as analytics goes, and not really control over the design of the page, but you can get started for free. If you step up to $9 a month, that's where you start getting access to really significant podcasting features. But that is just the deal that Podbean offers. If we go to Buzzsprout, they also will allow you to get started for free. And I think they're free for 90 days. I think they actually have another free version. If we go into the pricing, is Buzzsprout? Yeah. You can have 2 hours a month of podcasts for free as you start out. So they all want you to kind of get going, get your feet under you, and get started. And then once you're up and going with them, they are $12 a month. And we're going to see Libsyn here is probably very, very similar. If we take a look at the plans and pricing, do they have a free one? I don't even know. It doesn't look like they have a free one. They probably have a trial, but they start at $5 a month. Not a huge investment. And these tools, these services are exceptional. One of the things that I really like most about all of these services is they have wonderful tutorials online. They walk and hold your hand through the entire enrollment process of making sure that your podcast is properly published and seeded into the different podcast engines out there. So they do a terrific job of holding the hands of their creators. And you can rely on them to give you great advice and great training for free as a part of being a part of their community. That's one of the things that I really like about these services. As you get a little bit more serious about your podcast, we can start to up our game in a variety of different ways. First, you can probably add your podcast to your website, and you can create a blog structure within your website where you host your own podcasts, or you host the blog post for your podcasts, much the way you see us do at Dottotech. You might up the quality of microphone you have. I recently recorded a podcast with a friend of mine who purchased this Rode NT USB, which I thought was exceptional quality that she was using, and so I was just impressed with it, so I thought I would share it. You're gonna have a lot of fun researching your microphone. I can't tell you, we haven't tested them all out, but having done many interviews with many people on the other end, as I mentioned, the ATR 2100 is a great choice. This Rode was a great choice as well. It costs more, looks a little bit cooler, might be something that you want. But now, now of course, you'll also be using the proper podcast hosting services, and you'll probably be on paid plans with them. If you want to add another feature to your podcasts, you can now start to look at different ways to record double-ended podcasts. If you have a guest on, you can use Skype to record a call. A lot of us use Zoom to record our calls, and there's a variety of different techniques of plumbing in the audio into your computer or into something like the Rodecaster, which I have, so that you can record the audio tracks of the podcast before you edit them. But there's also some terrific services. This one, Riverside.fm, and the other one is Zencaster. These are really interesting services that will allow you to remotely record interviews. You send people a web link, then it connects you and them. It records your audio tracks separately in high fidelity. It'll also record the video tracks if you have your webcams on separately, so you can edit together a audio or a video podcast from the results. And their stock in trade is doing a good, high quality job of recording both ends of a podcast, or multiple, if you have multiple people on the podcast. So your editor, and when you go to edit, you've got good quality audio source material to create your podcast. Riverside.fm and Zencaster are the ones that I've noticed. I'm sure there are some other ones as well, but these are the two that I've considered using. I've ended up just myself continuing to record in Zoom because I actually don't record in Zoom, but I use a Zoom call and then I rewrote the audio into Hindenburg in order to record, and that's been working great for me. But there's lots of different ways to make this happen. You can start making all of this happen at the intermediate level. Then we step up to kind of the pro level, which is the advanced level, where you're starting to invest in your podcast. Up to now, you might be spending $300 a year on a tool like Hindenburg if you really want a really good audio editor, but you've spent a couple of $100s on a microphone. You're spending $10, $20 a month on your podcast hosting. The actual physical investment into your podcast isn't that great until you get to the advanced stage. At that point there, you might choose to go from USB audio to XLR to a pro quality audio setup. Now, my setup that I'm recording on right now, and I record my podcast, includes the Rodecaster Pro, which is around $600 US, $800 Canadian, which I really like for a variety of different reasons, but it's a terrific audio interface, mixer, recorder. What happens with these tools is once you step up to the pro quality microphone that has an XLR jack instead of a USB jack in the back, is we're dealing with an analog microphone at that point there. And this analog signal is very high quality, but it has to be converted into digital before we can work on it on our podcast. So tools like the Rodecaster or any audio interface, we call these tools audio interfaces, they will take your XLR connection and they will convert it, and they will plug into your computer, and they will convert it into a digital signal in USB so that you can edit it and record it within your computer. They're an essential part of the process, but it allows you to get into broadcast quality gear. The microphone that I use, I used in radio before I started to do my own podcast. So you've got the option to step up. Total investment here is over $1,000 for this gear, but the quality difference is fairly significant. Now, the interesting thing about podcasts, however, is I honestly don't believe that the audio quality of my $1,000 plus, it's close to $1,500 setup that I've got here is that much better than you're going to get with a $130 USB mic if you've got it properly set up and you've got a good, comfortable sound environment that's nicely protected and you're sitting close to the mic. People listening on their iPhone, they're probably not going to hear a big difference in quality. But it means a lot to me to know that I'm doing everything I can to make the fidelity of my podcast as good as possible. So that it's worth it to me, but it's not necessary. It's a nice to have, but you don't have to do it. Before we wrap things up, I'm going to talk to you about one last thing as you're starting out in your podcast. We talked a lot at the top about why podcasts fail. And the other reason that podcasts fail is they become too much work for the podcaster, even if they are starting to get traction. You can overcome a lot of that by designing a good format right from the beginning of your podcast that's sustainable for you. So if it's too much work for you to create a solo podcast of 40 minutes a week and you find writing that much content and carrying the weight that much yourself, if you find that to be arduous and you know it's going to create strain, then think about doing a co-hosted podcast where you have another person. I've got to tell you, having done years of radio, years of podcast, years of video, when I have somebody to talk to, it is so much easier than when I have to present the podcast solo. Even now, just recording this little bit here that I do in video, a lot more work than when I've got April on talking with me. So you can reduce the amount of stress, offload a lot of the work by choosing an appropriate co-host as part of the format for your podcast. And that will give you, I think that typically will give a podcast maybe a couple of extra months of runway before people start to feel the strain of the work. You're still going to feel strain. You're still going to feel pressure. Don't get me wrong, but consider the format of your podcast very carefully as you create it. We're all very passionate about it as the beginning, and we think we can do an awful lot, and we think we can just soldier through right at the beginning. But without the feedback, that will get tired and will start to wear on you at some point. So considering your podcast format is essential for success. Some things to look forward to. I've I've got a bunch of extra resources here, including a couple of tutorials for starting your podcasting. There are so many good resources online to teach you how to get started podcasting. And I'm going to say right up front that if you are serious about it, signing up for one of the main podcasting hosts, I'm talking Podbean, I'm talking about Libsyn, I'm talking about Sprout Social, choosing one of those as your host, and then going through the resources, the materials that they offer, that is your best guarantee of success, because they all do a terrific job of education. Now let's continue with education and get to your Q&A. All right, we're back. April will fire things up. Oh my goodness, that's frustrating. Sorry, I think it's not frustrating now that we're streaming fine and everybody's kind of found us, but oh my gosh, just frustrating off the top that it didn't come through. Oh, there's April. How are you there? There we go, April. How are you?
I'm good. Sorry, I couldn't find the stream. I had too many screens open.
Yeah,
so it's strange. We had two YouTube streams. Strange. So,
guys, keep an eye on your email this week, because I'm not too sure where we're gonna broadcast next week. We might end up going back into the webinar package. There's problems with every single package that you deliver into, and this was the second week or third week that we've had some technical issues. And to the few of you who commented and kind of blamed us for the technical issues, and, it's not our fault. We do the best we can. We set things up. One thing about what we do is we push the boundaries with these live streams that we do. And part of the learning process is finding out exactly how to do it. When you think about what we are doing right now, broadcasting to multiple platforms live, incorporating B-roll video in the case of the training videos that we insert, managing the conversations while it's happening in multiple fronts. I tell you, back in the day, way more technically advanced than what we were doing in television or radio, and things don't always work. We're at the mercy of bandwidth. We're at the mercy of updates to operating systems. We're at the mercy of updates to browsers. So there's a lot of different moving parts, and sometimes they break. And when they break, it's frustrating for everybody. But we don't need to be calling people out as a result of them breaking. It is nobody's fault. So I will get off my soapbox as far as that goes. And if
definitely some grumpy people today, for sure.
A few grumpy people, and they're making me grumpy.
I know.
I laugh. All right. So we got lots of questions. I really enjoyed recording that. I think one of the reasons I was so frustrated was I really thought there was a lot of value in that video when I finished it off this weekend. Just because I just see that podcasting is going to be so valuable as we move downstream. And if you remember way back to the beginning of the video when I talked about the marketplace and how we so often get caught up on numbers. You know, we need thousands of subscribers and views and all of those sorts of things. But recognizing that in podcasts, you have an intimate connection. You're right in the ears of a person for a long period of time. The retention rate, I'm telling you, that is a magical number. Over 80% of the content of when somebody subscribes to your podcast and they listen, over 80% of it they consume. And so even if you have a small, I hesitate to use the word small podcast, but if you have 20 or 30 people listening to your podcast, there's still real value there because you are actually landing with those 20 or 30 people. And you can't do that you don't have enough bandwidth in a day to reach 20 people for 40 minutes a day each. Just think about the math. So podcasting is so valuable. There was a couple of questions about that they felt it might be a little bit complex the way that I explain things. It used to be complex, and the way that we've set up our system was from that legacy of complexity of the way we set things up, going through the podcast hosts, etc. But they all make it very easy for you. And if you're intimidated, if you're interested and intrigued, and you would like to start a podcast, but you're a little bit intimidated by the process, do not be. Step by step, all of the different services, be it one of the more dedicated hosts like Podbean that I was talking about, or Anchor, or one of our viewers was really talking about a Podomatic, I think they called, and I've heard about them as well. I haven't checked them out myself, but they all do an excellent job of walking you through the process, and it doesn't require huge investment up front. What's most important is if your content is good. And you pay a little bit of attention to having good quality audio, but that is so approachable. You can do it with your earbuds on from your smartphone. We like to increase the quality because that's what we do. Is we're always looking to tweak things and do things a little better. But you can start out at a very, very comfortable level. The key reason that people stop once they start is that neediness of feedback. Is you do feel like you're publishing into a vacuum for quite a while when you're doing a podcast, and because we don't get the same immediate feedback. And I think I'm sure that's the main reason that so many podcasts do not continue. That they have listeners that would probably make it worthwhile. They just don't hear from them and have that direct connection, so they don't feel that there's much value, and that becomes a little bit deflating. All right.
It kind of reminds me sometimes when you have your first webinars and you're just getting started and you have questions, right? You ask for questions, and sometimes you have that deaf audience and people. Yeah.
Now, because we had a little bit of difficulties off the top and my video was extraordinarily long, we are closing in on the top of the hour. So if you have to leave, please go about with your day. We will be sending out the replay notice, which should be fine. I'm thinking the replay is going to be fine if you want to listen to the Q&A afterwards. But we'll keep going for maybe 10 or 15 minutes past the hour, and so we can answer as many questions as we can right now. So let's get into it. Do you want to keep watching them and just want me to read them and you keep monitoring for the questions?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good. Ellen is asking, do you edit the dynamic ads in or take them out? Is that how they are removed or moved at will? I think
with the dynamic ads, I haven't used them because we don't run ads in our podcast. Our podcast is designed to support our membership community. But with as far as I can understand, dynamic ads, you said an insertion point where the ad goes in. Now that can become a host read ad where you actually read the ad yourself if you are, depending on your agency that you're placing the ads with, or they will automatically place them. But they're placed at timestamps within your podcast. So when you construct your podcast, you construct it with breaks. The way we did, I used to do television that way. We would do the first block and then we'd have a break, and we didn't know what ad was going to run in that break. But it would be automatically inserted by the broadcaster. So that's it. Now, there's the jury is out because you have to have a certain number of downloads so that they can identify really accurately your demographic before dynamically inserted ads work. The nature of podcasting is generic ads have less value than endorsed ads from the host. Host-read ads have incredible value in podcasts because of the relationship you have with the host. So dynamic ads they do allow a lot of growth, especially to the top end of the market, and they legitimize podcasts to a certain extent, especially long-term podcasts, with lots of replay value. But for most of us, we're going to find a lot more value, direct relationship with a sponsor or advertiser where we do a host-read ad. That can also be dynamically inserted, but it can also be baked in. Okay.
All right. Giselle is asking, do we need a specific program like Hindenburg, or can we use Camtasia and export the audio?
And Deb Lee over on the YouTube channel was also asking about using Camtasia. Yeah, I think you could. There's no reason you couldn't use Camtasia as a audio editor, especially I could use ScreenFlow. I use ScreenFlow a lot, and I think I did do a few podcasts with it back in the day when I recorded them as video and audio at the same time, and then I just exported the audio track. You lose a little bit of the audio sweetening when you do that. You lose a little bit of the filters and some of the things that you can do with the audio. But as far as the narrative of editing together a podcast, it would work just fine.
All right. What advice do you have for choosing a name for a podcast?
Oh, gee. I guess it's probably more important than choosing the name for your YouTube channel. You'd have to have something that references the podcast itself and making sure, duh, Steve. That was Captain Obvious. But keeping it simple and easily identifiable. Don't be too cutesy. I'd say that our podcast, Gray Matters, is right on the edge of being the right amount of cutesy. I think it might be a little bit too cutesy for some, but I really liked it. So yeah. And if it's, there's nothing wrong with just, Steve Dotto's podcast. That also works. What?
So funny. I don't know. It just was funny.
It has to be something that relates to the podcast. That's why they tune in. That's why hundreds of people tune in each week.
There you go. What book would you say is a good guide to podcasting?
I don't know. I listened to his podcast. Where's my phone? Here's my phone. Just a minute. I'll tell you who the author is, and then you can figure out what book it is just by looking him up. Because I haven't read a book on podcasting, so I'm not an expert on that. But I do listen to a podcast of a guy that has been talking about his book. He's from the School of Podcasting. What's the guy's name? I can't remember his name. But look up School of Podcasting and look up the person who hosts it. He's just released a book which is supposed to be pretty good on podcasting. So he's the only one I know of for sure.
Okay.
And by the way, podcasting, listening to podcasts about podcasts while very meta is a really good way to learn.
Need to know the easiest approach for a beginner. Rarely need to redo or revise suggestions. So like, what's the easiest way with minimal revisions? I think that's what Ken is saying.
I think that the ones that we talked about, certainly if you're doing a single single read, you could certainly do something like, what did we mention? I had a few of them in here.
And they're all in the note too. So
yeah, they're all going to be shared.
Here's the replay.
But I'm also thinking that if you just want a straight recording, just recording your content. If you're talking about hosting it, are recommendations that are going to be in the shared note. But if you're talking about the simplest way to record a podcast, you could just using Zoom, as several people mentioned. I think Kitty does almost the exact same way as I record mine, except she records it directly in Zoom. I use Zoom as a conduit to record it into my editing app. But those are dead simple to do that way. And you can use Skype as well and record through
Somebody's
Skype.
mentioning Podcraft. Podcraft is a good resource.
Okay, I haven't checked it out, but thank you for sharing that.
All right. Does the post live on
Podbean site? Yeah, Deb, I answered Deb's question in the chat. So what you were seeing there is with the Podbean site, I showed that we upload and we create a post with all of our show notes and the podcast in it, and that lives on Podbean site. Podbean is one of those hybrid companies that's also a discovery engine or a listening tool. So Podbean has an app that many people use the way I use Overcast, and so the fact that we upload it to Podbean means that people that use the app get all the extra dressing of the post living there on the site. Plus, we could share that URL if we didn't have it on our own site. We duplicate that process and we also put it on our site. But if you're starting out, you can just use the blog post that is on your podcast supplier's site. I hope that we did a good job of explaining to you the different players in the game, from the podcast host to the distribution platforms to the player apps, because I think people get confused there. Well, I don't think people get confused. I get confused there sometimes, and I get confused on how to explain it. So I imagine there's a little bit of gray area for most of you, but I think we did a pretty good job of explaining it.
Is it true that monetary return is much higher than a YouTube video?
I don't know. If you're talking advertising revenue, cost per listen, I don't know. I imagine it would probably be pretty similar, but I can't say for sure since I've never monetized my podcast in that way. Instead, if you look at how much engagement you get, how valuable a call to action is, how valuable a person is who subscribes to you or reaches out to you as a result of your podcast, there are people that are very far along in the trust funnel with you. If they're listening to your podcast and they're responding to a call to action in the podcast, that's something that they actually have to buy in on. So where you are in your relationship is a lot farther on than the initial contact point from most other social platforms.
Oh, Mary just did a super chat to us. That was super nice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Jordan is asking, any recommendations for the length of a podcast? That's actually a great question.
That's a great question. I kind of think almost to a certain extent, a lot of people like to record podcasts to the length that they like to listen to podcasts themselves, because that's the one that works for them. It's how you do it. Personally, I find little short 5 to 7 minute podcasts too much work to listen to. And I haven't set up my podcast player to have a sequence where they play one after the other automatically, a playlist. I have a queue, but I just use that to invoke them as they go along. But some people do. Some really successful people have very short podcasts. I like to have it kind of meat on the bone, and so 30 minutes and up. So it's enough time that somebody, if they're cooking dinner, they can be listening to a podcast for most of the time that they're cooking the dinner. Or if you go for a walk with a dog, you can listen to it for a good part of the walk. I listen to a lot of podcasts that are over an hour. I go for a big long walk every night, and I listen for an hour to a podcast, and I love those podcasts. So it's going to be, how long is it not forced? How long does it take to deliver your content? And what do you like the idea of delivering?
All right, here's a great question. Best ways to market your podcast, especially in the beginnings.
And that's where patience is required. So we market them in all the places that we market other things. So you're going to be sharing your podcast in social. You can do paid ads. We sometimes do paid ads and run some traffic into Facebook if we've got a really good podcast. Certainly all of your social platforms. There's some great tools like Headliner and a few others that will take a piece of your podcast and convert it into a really nice Instagram or Facebook post with the text being displayed on screen along with a sound wave that people can listen. And what you do is you capture, kind of like the pull quotes that you would pull from a book or from a magazine article, those quotes that are kind of in bold to help you capture the essence. You do those, you look for those pull quotes within your podcast. You cut the little section out. You use Headliner to create a little video that you then post on social. And those are great ways to grow. But be prepared. No podcast, I can't imagine. Somebody, I guess, could, but I can't imagine any podcast growing anywhere near as fast as our newsletter or our YouTube channel or your Instagram or Facebook things. Those are far easier platforms to grow. But every growth that you have on your podcast is your customer. It's like getting their email address because they are subscribing to you, and there's no middleman standing between you and them. So that's why I love it. So you have to be patient, but you promote it in the same way as you do your other platforms.
How do you take advantage of YouTube for use with an audio-only podcast?
I think, some people do post their podcast audio only on YouTube, and I hear that people do listen to it. I've never felt like it was worthwhile. And since we've always been so video centric on YouTube, I felt like our audience would be disappointed personally. So I haven't explored it as much as others. Having said that, video podcasts, if you're doing a Zoom interview with somebody and you record it and you have the video on both sides and you use that in your YouTube channel, is, I think, that is one aspect that will help your podcast grow probably faster than any other of our social sharing things. But you've got to be willing to determine that you're going to edit the video, edit the podcast separate from the video. I think that the video edit is different than the audio edit. Because when you've got visuals happening, you can't necessarily dice up the podcast the same way as you can in audio. So you probably have twice the time editing, but you'll also get a lot more value out of it. Having said that, your channel has to be dedicated to that podcast. If you start putting a podcast on a channel that's supporting some other aspect of your business and it's a little bit tangential, YouTube hates variety. You want to make sure that your podcast, that YouTube channel is focused on your podcast, or your podcast hits right in the middle of the sweet spot of what your channel is all about.
All right. Miss Ravioli, I love that. Rodecaster versus Tascam typical mixer. What are the pros and cons?
The Rodecaster is so pretty. I love the lights on the Rodecaster. I can't say which one is better because that would require way more technical capability than I have. All the reviews I read about the Rodecaster I liked, and the Rodecaster also, it happens to have presets that are just gorgeous for my mic. So it just came together nicely for me. I know the Tascam and there's some other, Roland's got some nice ones. There's lots of good options out there. The one that you're most intrigued by that fits your budget is going to do a good job. I will tell you, I defy any audio engineer, audiophile in the world to sit down and listen to a podcast and tell you what gear it was recorded on. They can't. So as long as it sounds good, you're in good shape.
What are your thoughts people are talking about Zoom, right, to do your podcasting. But what are your thoughts about iMovie being able to edit there?
Well, GarageBand is better and it's free from Apple. So
Yeah.
iMovie, I guess it would be okay. It's kind of along the lines of what we were talking about with Camtasia, but
Right.
GarageBand is so much better for it. It's that would be the route that I would go if you're in the Apple world.
All right. You mentioned the pros and cons of doing a co-hosted podcast. Are there pros to your co-hosting being in the same recording studio, or is that no longer a big deal? It's a great question.
I don't think it's a big deal. I think it's how you work. We're so
your mic
comfortable now
too,
doing
right?
stuff like this. Yeah. The key is making sure you have good audio on both sides. So having both hosts having a good mic that's kind of an equal quality, and secondly, making sure that you're capturing a good stream, that you're capturing it. So if there are issues in Zoom, for example, is not doing a good enough job because of your bandwidth, then looking at one of those tools like Riverside.fm becomes a good way to do it because it sits in the middle and it captures high quality streams from both sides.
All right. Are different audiences on different hosts? Should we post to multiple?
No, I don't think so. Not unless you have a different podcast, like a different topic, then you can. But no, the thing about podcasting is the way that the feed goes is when you create your podcast, say in Podbean, and you initially set up your distribution for it, you submit it to Stitcher, and you submit it to iHeartRadio, and you submit it to Apple, and you submit it to Google. And so there's no, other than Spotify might shut some people out. Like Spotify has some exclusive properties, but for us, we can distribute to them all. So we should distribute to them all, but we don't have do a unique product to any other one. I don't see any point for you or I to exclusively say broadcast on Spotify. Spotify is giving Rogan millions of dollars to be exclusive there. And I think they gave Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen, I think it was Spotify, gave them, a lot of money to have their product exclusively on Spotify. They're not going to give Steve Dotto a lot of money to be exclusive on Spotify, at least not yet.
Is there a basic app or program for PC to separate audio from video? Natalie's asking that. I mean, any video editing app will strip out your audio. So whatever you're using for video, you can just export the audio as a separate track. And then you can import it into another audio editing app or use that export if it's already been edited. Let's see. Jeffrey's asking, he's asking, I use a USB mixer for my Zoom podcast creation, but I can't hear both incoming and outgoing audio at the same time. Why is that?
It's just the way you've got your routing set up. So if you're using Zoom and say so the way that I've got it, and everyone's going to be a little different. I won't explain every parameter to you, but Zoom sends its audio to whatever audio device you choose. So if you don't have anything chosen, it's going to send it to system audio. So it's going to come out of your speakers or your headphones that are plugged in as per normal. But if you are doing a podcast with somebody and you want to hear them, what you can, and you're recording it into your audio player, into your audio interface, what you have to do is you have to go into Zoom and you have to choose that audio interface as the audio, as the speakers for Zoom. Then you plug your headphones into your audio device, and you'll be able to hear the person in it because the audio is routing through there, not through your computer's audio. So it just comes down to plumbing. It's which pipes you connect where. So that's where your problem is. I'm sure now you'll be able to go in and you'll be able to figure it out.
Can you do a podcast on an iPad?
Yes, there's lots of good podcasting tools on the iPad. I don't know what they are. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but absolutely.
All right. Did you mention Anchor FM as a free solution owned by Spotify for podcasting?
Anchor FM, yes. Yeah, they're included in the note for sure.
Awesome. What are the key things Rodecaster does?
Rodecaster it's multiple things. First of all, it's a mixer, so it allows us to take multiple audio sources and mix them together and send them out it's an audio interface, so it'll convert it into digital for our computer. It actually has a built-in recording. So if you were on the road, if we can ever travel again, I could take the Rodecaster and a couple of microphones, plug them in, set them down on a table somewhere, and do a great podcast or a great recording with multiple people and do all of the mixing and control right here. It also is a playback deck. It's got the ability for me to have lots of music and sound in it and just hit buttons and be able to insert audio as a bed underneath if you're doing something live. So if you want music before your podcast and you're broadcasting live, it will do all of that. It is freaking amazing. 4 inputs, 4 mics. Plus, it'll allow you to plug your phone in. You can plug a phone in or Bluetooth a phone in as another source.
Oh boy, you've tapped on his technical geeky side of things. Can you hear the excitement in his voice?
I love the Rodecaster, and I'm sure there are better ones, but it works great. I think we should wrap things up, April. We're 15 minutes over, and I want to do one more shout out to our patrons at Patreon. It sounds like we lost a few today, so we're going to need a few more. I think it was just one. That if you find value in our in the content that we produce here at Dottotech, please drop by our Patreon page and take a look and find out what it takes to support Dottotech and to keep us on the air and producing this sort of free training and tutorial content. Patreon.com/Dottotech. The main perk is at the $10 a month level. We take each one of these tutorials and we archive them for you. There's 163 of them now in there, and they are all available to our patrons. For everybody else, you can view the replay for a week. I encourage you, check your email extra close this week because I'm not 100% positive that we are going to be streaming live. This live stuff works fine with you and I chatting here, April, but the video is driving me freaking nuts getting that feed going through properly. And also just the starting of it today was something, but I have a call queued up with the powers that be that make it happen for us. So we'll see where we sit after we have a quick conversation, but we might be back in traditional webinar package next week. Next week's show, it's going to be something a little bit more for the baby boomers and Gen X. It's finding a job in 2021. How has employment changed as far as going out there prospecting, finding, and hiring people in the year 2021? So something pragmatic from that perspective. A big change from podcasting next week. Don't forget, we have Foundational Friday coming up this week, which is our new product, which we are sharing with you. April is going to be the star of the show this week, and she's sharing how to build funnels, sales funnels. In Foundational Fridays, we teach you the basics of online marketing, of building an online business. And we're going to be talking about sales funnels, which April is an exceeding expert at. That's it. Are we done?
We are done. Thank you so much for your patience today, friends. You
Everybody
guys are rocks
in there and gave us the grace to allow us to work our way through it. I thank you. Everybody else. Am I being petulant?
No, no.
Thank
You know
so
what?
much.
People were just being some cranks today. It's okay. We all get cranky, especially when we get a little gray. So
there you go.
Bye, guys.
Hey, everybody.
Thank you.
And if anybody's going to start a podcast, let me know. I'd love to encourage you to do it. I think that's as you can tell, I love the idea. Thank you, April. Till next time, folks. Have fun storming the castle.